Books, Bullets, and Babies comes from the first line of my personal statement that I wrote to get into grad school. So welcome to season 1, episode 1 of Books, Bullets, and Babies, the podcast. I am your host, Dr. Sagashus Levingston, and I am so excited to have you. Let me just let y'all know, this podcast is going to be lit. You know why? Because we've gone through so much stuff to make this happen. This season, you are going to laugh about the stories we will be able to share with you. You're going to laugh about the things we had to do and the reasons why we had to laugh to keep from crying just to make this happen. So before we jump into the actual podcast, let me introduce to you some of our collaborators who helped make this possible. I'd like to acknowledge first American Families Institute for Corporate and Social Impact as a major sponsor for this pilot series. I'd also like to introduce to you all Cuna Mutual Group Foundation, and they have been significant also in the support that they've provided to make this podcast possible. Next up, we have UW Health, and as we go on, I will share some stories with you about how their support has really spearheaded some amazing work around health and wellness within our community. Finally, I would like to acknowledge the support of the Morgridge Family Foundation and their role in helping us create our Third Space virtual co-working platform, as well as their role in helping making this podcast possible. So those were the people who supported us financially. But there are also folks we'd like to acknowledge for supporting us creatively. We'd like to acknowledge Kristin Mitchell Design for designing our Books, Bullets, and Babies logo and all of the iconography around this effort, as well as some other things that you will hear about as the podcast progresses. And I would like to thank B. Brown Productions. We are here in Atlanta filming this podcast because we understood that many of our listeners will be listening and gaining information through YouTube, as well as through streaming services such as Spotify and iTunes. For that reason, we are in Atlanta with B. Brown Productions, who have expressed an infinite amount of patience with just this whole entire process. So I would like to, before we jump into just the work of the podcast, it's very important that we just say thank you to those folks who's making all of this possible. All right, you all. So what is Books, Bullets, and Babies, and where do we even get this title from? Books, Bullets, and Babies comes from the first line of my personal statement that I wrote to get into grad school. And I knew that wherever I went, it was going to be very important to me that I was very transparent about my realities, in part because I wanted to succeed, in part because and I knew part of that success was going to be, in order for me to succeed, those people who were going to be working with me had to understand the circumstances under which I was coming in from and what I'll be bringing to the table in terms of my life, as well as my academic abilities. And so to kind of give them an idea of what that combination or unique combination of circumstances I was bringing to the table were, I started my personal statement by saying, Books, Bullets, and Babies, I juggle all three. At the time, I was a single mom. I had 3 children. I was coming from the south side of Chicago, and I was an undergrad completing my senior year at the University of Illinois at Chicago. And I knew that there were going to be things on my transcript that might have been a little sketchy. I knew that there was going to be some circumstances about my life when I showed up that might have raised some questions. And one way I was able to explain that is by pointing out that I was dealing with responsibilities that not only often competed against one another, they often contradicted one another. And I wanted to be very clear about that up front. But the other thing I wanted to be able to be clear about was that even while I had those things going on, I knew that I was a finisher. Whatever I started, I was going to complete, regardless of the challenges I was faced against. As I was thinking about a concept for this podcast, that idea came back to me, that line came back to me: book splits and babies. And I realized that the focus of this podcast had to be about what does it mean to juggle competing responsibilities and sometimes contradictory responsibilities while women were pursuing wealth. So that leads me to not only the what, but also the who. Who is this podcast for? It's for that population of women. It's for women who find themselves juggling competing responsibilities while also trying to increase their bottom line. I think it's important that I outline for you a couple of things that you can expect during this podcast series. One of the first things I'm hoping you all are able to experience is the humanization, and I hope you're able to walk away from an episode and experience or feel as if we've humanized the wealth process for you. So many times women, especially women of color, especially moms, while pursuing wealth, often feel as if the conversations are sterile and they're isolating and they're institutional. And we didn't want that experience to be one that we offered our women. We wanted our women to be able to see themselves in their wealth journey, or in the stories that we tell and experiences that we offer and create, and the strategies that we create and offer and share. We want you to look forward to series that will help close the trust gap between our audience and financial institutions. And we do that by facilitating dialogues between our audience and those institutions. I think the third thing you can look for from this podcast series is inspiration. Building wealth, building your companies while juggling so much can be overwhelming. It can be daunting. It can make you want to hide up under a table and cry. And we get that. And so our goal is to not only be very transparent about those moments when we've not only wanted to, but have hid under tables and cried. We want to share stories with you about how we were able to talk ourselves and each other from under that table to show up and to be extraordinary. The fourth thing you should expect from this podcast is a lot of laughs. So much of the wealth journey, as we've just talked about, can be overwhelming. And sometimes we laugh just to keep from crying. Sometimes we laugh because stuff is just actually funny. And sometimes we laugh just out of pure gratitude and excitement and joy for the things that we've been able to accomplish, the odds we've been able to defy, and the ways in which we've been able to show up and provide solutions and create opportunities for ourselves and each other. So we are all about infusing joy, genuine joy and laughter into this process. Fifth, come here to find your community. A lot of times we show up in these spaces that are focused on wealth and entrepreneurship. And even when people look like us, their stories may not be consistent with our own. But often people don't look like us. And often their trajectories have been different from ours. And so we want you to come here so that you can see yourself in this process. We want you to come here so that you can learn about other women and build relationships and bridges, so that your experience is not only one that is a journey amongst sisters, is one in which you are able to network and you're able to leverage opportunities with, for, and on behalf of one another. And I think finally, come here to get good information. Come here to find information in the form of interviews in the form of the books and the knowledge we'll be sharing and exploring together. Come here to get information and to gain knowledge from our Books, Bullets, and Babies card game. So who is this podcast for? The Books, Bullets, and Babies podcast is for mothers who juggle competing and often contradictory responsibilities on their journey towards wealth. It is part of the Infamous Mothers LLC company, which creates and curates content for mothers who defy odds and who build mothering practices on their own terms. We've gone over the who, we've gone over the what. Let's go a little bit into the where. We have a couple of locations in which this podcast is being filmed. The first one is Atlanta, Georgia. We are so excited to be here. We are here specifically to collaborate with B. Brown Productions, who does very good work, starting with us in Madison, Wisconsin. So good that we are following her and the company here. And the second part of this podcast is being filmed in Madison, Wisconsin. So we're going to bring it back to headquarters and wrap up in Madison, Wisconsin. We have explored the who, what, and the where. Let's go a little bit into the when. So if you are listening to this podcast when we first drop it, look forward to the release of 12 episodes, 1 episode per week for our season 1 pilot. And why did we create this podcast? We created this podcast because representation matters. Even when wealth experts think that they are including us in the conversation, often we don't see ourselves in their stories, their strategies, and in their circumstances. And so we feel left out. For that reason, we've decided to create a podcast about the wealth experience that is for us and by us. Diversity, equity, and inclusion is very important to us. And with that in mind, we realize that people who listen to this podcast, many of those folks will find our information in places like Spotify and Apple Music. But we also realize that we'll have a population of women that may never go to Spotify or Apple Music and would prefer to consume their information from a visual source like YouTube. With both of those populations in mind, we've decided to take a two-pronged approach to producing and creating Books, Bullets, and Babies. And that approach includes both audio and visual. I think when we explore and consider the how, it's also important for us to double back to the what. And what I mean by that is our approach this season, our how, is going to always echo back to this one what that we did not explore, but I think is worth exploring in this first episode. And that is, what is the question what question will we be exploring this season? This season, we're looking to answer the question, can the women we call infamous mothers become millionaires? And if your answer is yes, what does that process look like for them? And if your answer is, and whether it's yes or no, we want to know why or why not. Books, Bullets, and Babies, the card game, first roll of the die this season. Oh. Whew, fell on PC for Player's Choice. I'm going to take a risk with this one. And I'm going to pull from the wild card deck, which is bullets. That means I can get a question around health, wealth, entrepreneurship, pleasure. I just don't know what I'm going to get. Let's see. Ooh, okay. I lucked up. Not so much, though. Name one physical activity you've worked to master. Oh, jeez. So for the past year, the Infamous Mothers brand has been on a health and wellness journey, and I have been accompanying and working alongside of other women. And one thing that I have worked to master, I've worked to master my downward facing dog. In the past, I've avoided that position because it requires so much. Sometimes it looks and feels awkward, and I would avoid that position in every yoga class. I would just fall and drop straight to child's pose because, but this year I can say that I've worked to master my downward facing dog.
All right, you all, it's time for a disrespectful tidbit. And why do we call it disrespectful? Because sometimes we're just giving up too much damn information. TMI. So today's disrespectful tidbit is a little bit of TMI from my own life. Do you know that for the 9 days we shot episodes in Atlanta for this podcast and the two videos we created outside of it, I was so afraid that our producer had to coach me through panic attacks, paralysis, and extend to me a whole lot of grace because I was definitely giving off flight risk vibes. Did you also know that for the Infamous Mothers play every night for 11 nights, I cried in the bathroom before it was time to go on stage? My best friend, who lives in Chicago, again, had to coach me so that I can make it to that stage while I was in Wisconsin, the stage that was in Madison, Wisconsin. So I'm in Madison, he's in Chicago, and he's having to coach me from under the sink so that I can make it to the stage. There's very little things in life that I have done that I didn't do afraid. In fact, I expect fear to show up before major projects and during big events. As much as I have accomplished in life, I have yet to conquer fearlessness. I will tell you, though, that I have learned to rely on my support system to help me show up, especially when I'm afraid. The next time you experience fear before something important in your life happens, who will you choose to help you show up? That's today's tidbit. A little disrespectful, a lot of TMI, but it's the tidbit.